The penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline was perfectly quiet, the clinking of champagne glasses from the promotion party finally fading into the night. But as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her reflection betrayed her. Her hands trembled around the divorce papers her husband had signed before vanishing without a trace, leaving behind an empire built on a lie. The silence wasn't a victory, it was the deafening sound of a trap snapping shut. If stories of shattered illusions and the quiet, devastating cost of betrayal resonate with you, I hope you'll stay and walk through this journey with me. There are still many doors left unopened in this house of secrets. The view from the 42nd floor of the Ashford Media Group Tower offered a glittering tapestry of Manhattan, but Evelyn Brooks was looking at her own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass. She held a crystal tumbler of scotch, the ice clinking softly in the heavy silence of her corner office. It was 11:30 p.m. The promotion party had ended an hour ago. She was now the youngest senior vice president in the firm's history. She had won. Her phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. A text from Tyler Black lit up the screen. "Proud of you, beautiful. See you at my place. The champagne is cold." Evelyn smiled, a thin, sharp curve of her lips. Tyler was the prize she had riskily reached for a man who spoke the same ambitious language she did, whose touch tasted of danger and corporate adrenaline. For 2 years, their affair had been a high-wire act of stolen hotel keys and encrypted messages. It was intoxicating. But what made tonight truly euphoric wasn't just the promotion or Tyler's waiting bed. It was the absolute frictionless ease with which she had shed the dead weight of her past. Austin. She walked over to her desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside lay the final dissolution of marriage decree signed in black ink exactly 3 weeks ago. There had been no screaming matches, no shattered plates, no dramatic courtroom battles. When Austin had finally connected the late-night client dinners to Tyler's name, Evelyn had braced herself for a hurricane. She had rehearsed her defense, her justifications about how they had grown apart, how his quiet, steady life as an independent data analyst was suffocating her relentless drive. Instead, Austin had looked at her with an expression she still couldn't decipher. It wasn't anger, it was a terrifying, hollow finality. "Keep the house. Keep the accounts," he had said, his voice level. He had signed the papers, packed a single duffel bag, and walked out the door. He didn't ask for a dime of her Ashford salary, nor did he try to ruin her reputation at the firm. He simply ceased to exist in her world. His phone number went dead. His email bounced back. At first, Evelyn interpreted his silent departure as the ultimate submission. He had folded. He knew he couldn't compete with Tyler, couldn't compete with the trajectory of her life. She had beaten him, claiming everything she wanted without paying the social toll of a messy public divorce. She finished her scotch, the burn grounding her. But as she reached to turn off the desk lamp, a notification pinged on her laptop. It was an automated alert from the firm's PR tracking software. The Harrison account, her flagship client, was trending negatively on social media due to a leaked supply chain rumor. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed over her skin. It was a minor crisis, the kind of logistical fire she usually handed off to. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. Before the affair, before the silence, Austin had been her shadow strategist. He was the one who quietly drafted the crisis mitigation plans while she slept, the invisible architect of her flawless reputation. Call him. He knows the Harrison board. The thought flickered instinctively before reality slammed into her. She couldn't call him. He was gone. Evelyn pulled her hand back, staring at the flashing red alert on the screen. The silence of the corner office suddenly felt less like a throne room and more like a vacuum. She picked up her phone to text Tyler about the crisis, but hesitated. Tyler was brilliant at pitching new business, but he despised the messy work of putting out fires. He would tell her to delegate it to Mike Johnson and come over for a drink. For the first time since the divorce papers were signed, a faint metallic taste of panic touched the back of her throat. She looked back at the sprawling city lights, the glittering world she had conquered. It was entirely hers now, and she was entirely alone in it. The morning sunlight sliced through the blinds of Conference Room B, casting harsh geometric shadows across the polished glass table. Evelyn sat at the head, projecting the quiet authority her new title demanded. To her immediate right sat Tyler. He was leaning back, the custom tailoring of his Italian suit catching the light, projecting an effortless, predatory confidence. It was supposed to be a routine strategy alignment for the upcoming quarter, a meeting Evelyn had meticulously prepared for. But within the first 20 minutes, the dynamic shifted. I think what Evelyn is trying to say, Tyler interrupted, his voice smooth as he leaned forward casually, resting his arm along the back of her chair, is that the Harrison account needs a more aggressive push. We bleed them dry now or they jump ship to a boutique agency by Q3. Evelyn's posture remained rigid. Beneath the table, her fingernails pressed into the palm of her hand. What Evelyn is trying to say, she hated the phrase. It was a subtle usurpation of her voice wrapped in a veneer of partnership. Tyler's fingers brushed the silk of her blouse just below her collar, an intimacy invisible to most of the room but loud enough to deafen her. He was marking his territory, blurring the lines between their private hotel rooms and her corporate domain. She forced a tight, professional smile, carefully ignoring his touch. Actually, Tyler, my point was about retention through stability, not aggression. We manage the current supply chain rumors first. Tyler offered a careless shrug, a boyish smirk playing on his lips. Just offering a bolder perspective, Evie. The use of the nickname in front of the senior team made the air in the room momentarily thin. Evelyn saw Mike Johnson, the firm's veteran director of operations, shift uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze dropping to his notepad. When the meeting finally adjourned, the room emptied quickly. Tyler lingered by the door, offering Evelyn a knowing look before stepping out into the hallway. She was gathering her folders when Mike cleared his throat from the other end of the table. He's certainly comfortable, Mike said, his tone perfectly flat. Evelyn snapped a folder shut, defensive. Tyler brings a lot of energy to the table. The board likes his initiative. Mike slowly screwed the cap onto his fountain pen. He was a man who had survived 3 CEO transitions at Ashford by reading the currents beneath the surface. Energy is good for pitching, Evelyn, but it's volatile. Tyler has a habit of setting fires just to prove he can walk through the smoke. I can manage him, Mike. Can you saw? Mike looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting hers with unsettling clarity. When you were with Austin, your campaigns were airtight, bulletproof. You took the spotlight, but the foundation was solid titanium. Tyler is a kite in a hurricane. Just be careful what you tether yourself to now. If he crashes, he's the kind of man who will pull you down with him. Mike didn't wait for a response. He picked up his leather portfolio and walked out, leaving Evelyn alone in the quiet hum of the air-conditioned room. She stood frozen, the folders heavy in her arms. The mention of Austin's name felt like a sudden sharp drop in temperature. Solid titanium. She remembered the late nights in their suburban kitchen, Austin patiently reviewing her risk assessments, spotting the unseen flaws while she drank wine and talked over him. Evelyn walked back to her corner office, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She closed the door and now looked at her phone. A message from Tyler waited on the screen. Bored. Cancel your 2 p.m. and come down to the archive room. A month ago, the text would have sent a thrill of dangerous electricity through her veins. Today, as she stared at the words, the screen felt cold. The glass of her perfect new reality hadn't shattered, but as she typed a brief clinical refusal, she felt the first distinct crack creeping across the surface. 72 hours later, the minor rumor regarding the Harrison account metastasized into a full-blown financial hemorrhage. A leading business journal had picked up the story about exploited overseas labor in their supply chain, and the client's stock was plummeting in after-hours trading. Evelyn's office, usually a sanctuary of sleek minimalism, felt like a pressure cooker. It was 1:15 a.m. The glow of 3 computer monitors illuminated her face, washing her pale skin in a sickly artificial blue light. Spreadsheets, sentiment analysis, dashboards, and frantic email threads from the Harrison board were tiled across the screens, a chaotic mosaic of impending ruin. She rubbed her temples, trying to massage away the dull ache throbbing behind her eyes. She needed to trace the origin of the leak to discredit the source before the morning bell rang on Wall Street. She stared at the raw data pouring into the terminal. Rows and columns of IP addresses, time-stamped forum posts, and encrypted server nodes. It was a digital labyrinth, and Evelyn possessed no map. A memory unbidden and sharp surfaced in the quiet room. She was standing in the doorway of Austin's home office, holding a glass of Cabernet. Austin was hunched over his mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the space as lines of code reflected in his glasses. PR is just storytelling, Evie, he had murmured, not looking away from the screen as he untangled a similar web of corporate sabotage for her 2 years ago. But the data tells the truth. You just have to know how to listen to the math. Within 2 hours that night, Austin had isolated the leak, handed her the narrative she needed to spin, and gone back to sleep. He was the engine. She was the polished hood ornament. It was a truth she had buried under layers of ego and ambition. Now staring at the incomprehensible numbers, the silence of the room was deafening. She didn't know how to write the query. She didn't know how to filter the noise. Her phone vibrated against the desk. The caller ID flashed Tyler's name. She snatched it up, a desperate hope flaring in her chest. "Tyler, tell me you have the media list ready," she said, skipping the greeting. There was a burst of background noise, the heavy rhythmic thumping of a club bass track and the clinking of glasses. "Evie, relax." Tyler's voice came through, slightly slurred, layered with a dismissive arrogance. "I'm with the digital team at Soho House. We're brainstorming. Just tell Harrison we're launching a counter-campaign about their green initiatives tomorrow. Smoke and mirrors, babe. Works every time." Evelyn closed her eyes. The nausea hit her in a slow, cold wave. A green initiative wouldn't stop a hemorrhage of this scale. It would look like a desperate, tone-deaf cover-up. Tyler didn't understand the anatomy of the crisis. He only understood the performance. "Tyler, they need a forensic trace, not a billboard," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We're PR, Evelyn, not hackers. Let their IT guys handle it. Come down here, you're working too hard." She hung up without saying goodbye. She placed the phone face down on the mahogany desk, the sudden quiet of her office pressing against her eardrums. For a long moment, she just sat there, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the cold surface of her desk. She opened a blank browser tab and typed Austin's name into the search bar, followed by his old firm, his old email, anything. The results were archaic, old conference listings, a dead LinkedIn page. He had scrubbed himself clean from the digital world. She was looking at an empty screen, the flashing cursor taunting her. The terrifying realization settled over her shoulders like a lead weight. Austin hadn't just left her. He had taken the safety net that held her entire world together, and she was currently in a free fall. The morning after the supply chain leak, the air in Evelyn's office felt thick, practically vibrating with the impending fallout. She needed a firewall, a media blackout across the major financial networks until she could effectively spin the narrative. She had exactly one card left to play: Marcus Vance. Vance was a heavyweight media broker, a gatekeeper who controlled the editorial slant of 3 major business syndicates in the city. Over the past 4 years, Evelyn had cultivated what she believed was a sterling professional friendship with him. They had shared expensive dinners in Tribeca, laughed over rare scotch, and celebrated mutually beneficial deals. She was Evelyn Brooks. People answered her calls. She picked up her phone and dialed his private number. It rang 3 times before his assistant answered, her tone impeccably polite and utterly impenetrable. "I'm sorry, Ms. Brooks. Mr. Vance is tied up in meetings all morning." "It's urgent, Sarah. Just tell him Evelyn needs 2 minutes. A brief pause filled only by the faint static of the line. "Mr. Vance left specific instructions. He is unavailable to Ashford Media regarding the Harrison situation." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "Sarah, Marcus and I go way back. If he could just—" "Ms. Brooks," the assistant interrupted, the practiced warmth vanishing entirely from her voice. "Mr. Vance asked me to convey a message if you pressed. He said to tell you that his debt was to Austin for the Boston data recovery in 2022. That account is now settled. He wishes you the best of luck." The line went dead. Evelyn slowly lowered the receiver. The dial tone hissed in the quiet office like a snake. His debt was to Austin. The words echoed in her mind, stripping away another layer of her meticulously crafted reality. The dinners, the laughter, the exclusive access, none of it had been a testament to her brilliance. She had been wearing Austin's credibility like a borrowed coat, parading it as her own. And now the true owner had taken it back. The office door swung open without a knock. Tyler strolled in, bringing with him the sharp, overpowering scent of expensive cologne and stale alcohol from the night before. He dropped into one of the leather visitor chairs, throwing his legs casually over the armrest. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Evie," he said, scrolling through his phone with a bored expression. "Harrison's stock is only down 8%. It will bounce back by Friday." "Marcus Vance just blacklisted us," Evelyn said, her voice hollow. Tyler stopped scrolling and looked up, a momentary flicker of annoyance crossing his handsome features. Vance, the old guy, screw him. He's a dinosaur. I'll get my guys at the digital outlets to flood the SEO channels. We don't need traditional syndicates. You don't understand. She snapped, a sudden, unfamiliar edge of desperation bleeding into her tone. Vance controls the narrative for the institutional investors. If he doesn't hold the line, the board will panic. We need leverage. Tyler sighed loudly, letting his head fall back against the leather chair. You're overthinking this, Evelyn. You always do when you're stressed. You're letting a little turbulence ruin the vibe. Just put out a generic PR apology and let the legal team deal with the fallout. That's what they're paid for. He stood up, walking behind her desk, and leaned down to kiss her neck. A week ago, the gesture would have sent a rush of heat through her. Now she felt only the cold, hard knot of anxiety sitting heavy in her stomach. She pulled away a millimeter of distance that felt like a mile. I have work to do, Tyler. He paused, his eyes hardening slightly at the rejection. Suit yourself. Let me know when you are done playing martyr. He walked out the heavy oak door, clicking shut behind him. Evelyn stared at the empty chair. The chasm between them, once hidden beneath the thrill of their illicit romance, was suddenly gaping wide. Tyler was a man for sunny days and champagne toasts. But as the storm clouds gathered over her career, she realized with bone-chilling clarity that he had no idea how to build a shelter. And the man who did was nowhere to be found. The private elevator opened directly into Evelyn's penthouse, a sprawling minimalist space of white leather, brushed steel, and cold perfection. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the glittering Manhattan skyline into a blurred watercolor. She dropped her designer trench coat onto a chair, the exhaustion of the past 4 days settling deep into her bones. On the sleek marble console table in the foyer sat a small unbranded cardboard box. Evelyn frowned. She wasn't expecting a delivery. She picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the packing tape. Inside, resting on a bed of bubble wrap, was a small velvet pouch and a handwritten note on stationery from a boutique horologist in Brooklyn. Ms. Brooks, the restoration on Mr. Bell's grandfather's watch is finally complete. Apologies for the year-long delay. We used the primary address on file. Evelyn's breath hitched. She reached into the pouch and pulled out the vintage silver pocket watch. The metal was cold against her palm, but as she held it, she could hear the faint rhythmic heartbeat of the mechanical gears ticking inside. It was the only thing Austin had truly cared about inheriting from his family, left at the repair shop long before the divorce, long before Tyler, long before the silence. A sudden physical wave of guilt washed over her, so intense it made her knees weak. She sank onto the edge of the white leather sofa, clutching the watch. The ticking seemed to grow louder, filling the cavernous emptiness of the apartment. It was a tangible piece of the man she had erased, a ghost, slipping through the cracks of her perfectly curated life. Driven by a sudden, suffocating panic, Evelyn walked quickly to the kitchen island and opened her personal laptop. The screen illuminated her pale, tense face in the dark room. She bypassed standard search engines and logged directly into the premium investigative databases she used for vetting corporate executives. She typed in his full name, date of birth, social security number. Searching. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Evelyn chewed the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. She needed a location, a new job title, a credit card swipe at a gas station, anything to prove he was still tethered to the same reality she was. 0 results found. She blinked, refusing to believe it. She ran the query again, expanding the parameters to every state, filtering through property records, utility registrations, and vehicle databases. Nothing. His old bank accounts were closed. His name had been scrubbed from public registries. He hadn't just moved, he had systematically dismantled his digital footprint with the same surgical precision he used to fix her PR disasters. He was a phantom. Evelyn closed the laptop slowly. She looked around the luxurious penthouse, the physical manifestation of her victory. She had kept the house, the accounts, the prestige. But sitting there in the dark, listening to the relentless ticking of a watch that belonged to a man who no longer existed, the truth finally broke through her defenses. Austin hadn't left her with nothing. He had left her with exactly what she asked for and stripped away the only thing that made it bearable. She buried her face in her hands, the silence of the empty apartment pressing down on her like a physical weight, and for the first time since she signed the divorce papers, Evelyn wept. The red urgent flag on the email from Ashford's legal department seemed to pulse on Evelyn's monitor. It was 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the air conditioning in the building had suddenly ceased to provide any relief. She read the subject line, twice the words blurring together, SEC inquiry. Nexus Tech pre-merger leak. Nexus Tech was the joint account she and Tyler had leveraged to secure her promotion. It was a delicate multi-billion-dollar merger that required absolute silence until Friday. But the numbers, the exact confidential financial projections, were currently plastered across a mid-tier financial blog. Evelyn didn't wait for her assistant. She walked briskly down the glass-paneled hallway, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She pushed open the door to Tyler's office without knocking. He was leaning back in his chair, tossing a golf ball in the air and catching it. He didn't even flinch when the door hit the stopper. "Did you see the Nexus leak?" Evelyn demanded, her voice barely a whisper to keep it from carrying into the corridor. She shut the blinds with a sharp pull. Tyler caught the ball and smirked. "Relax, Evie. I sent a few soft numbers to a guy I know at the blog. It builds hype. By the time the bell rings Friday, the valuation will be up 12%. We'll look like geniuses." Evelyn stared at him, the blood draining from her face. "You sent confidential pre-merger financials to an unvetted third party, Tyler. That's not PR. That is textbook insider trading. The SEC is already contacting our legal department." For a fraction of a second, the arrogant mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine panic in Tyler's eyes. But he quickly recovered, standing up and closing the distance between them. "They can't prove I sent it. It was from a burner email. You logged into the company VPN to access the Nexus folder before sending it," Evelyn said, her voice turning to ice as she pieced together his reckless stupidity. "The IT department will pull the server logs in less than an hour. They will see your IP address." "Then fix it," he said, stepping into her personal space, his voice dropping to a low, demanding register. "You're the senior VP. You have admin clearance. Go into the system and scrub the access logs. Tell them it was an external breach." The silence in the room was suffocating. Evelyn looked at the man she had torn her life apart for. He wasn't a master strategist. He was a reckless child playing with matches in a powder keg, and now he was asking her to stand in the fire. If she let him fall, the scandal would taint the entire Nexus account. Her flagship's success would be investigated. Her promotion revoked, her judgment questioned. She would lose everything she had fought for. Slowly, her hands trembling, she walked around his desk and sat in his leather chair. She logged into the administrative terminal, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. Austin's voice echoed in the back of her mind, a quiet reminder of integrity of titanium foundations. She was about to shatter the last piece of her own morality. She bypassed the security protocols, navigating to the back-end server logs. With a few keystrokes, she highlighted the timestamp of Tyler's access and initiated the deletion sequence. The progress bar loaded, erasing his guilt and sealing hers. "Done," she whispered, her throat dry. Tyler exhaled a long breath, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "I knew I could count on you, partner." Evelyn didn't move. She stared at the blank screen, the metallic taste of true criminality bitter on her tongue. The cover-up was complete, but as the faint hum of the server room vibrated beneath her feet, she knew the unraveling of her life had just crossed the point of no return. The Ashford Media Group offices were hollow and silent at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. The cleaning staff had already made their rounds, leaving behind the faint, sterile scent of lemon polish. Evelyn stood by her desk, slipping her laptop into her leather tote. She was exhausted, a deep, marrow-deep fatigue that no amount of espresso could touch. The heavy oak door of her office clicked shut. She turned, startled. Mike Johnson stood just inside the room, his hand still on the brass knob. He didn't look angry. He looked aged, the harsh fluorescent light from the hallway carving deep shadows into the lines around his mouth. He walked slowly toward her desk and placed a single crisp sheet of paper on the mahogany surface. "I ran a secondary diagnostic on the Nexus server breach." Mike said, his voice quiet and devoid of its usual warmth. Evelyn stared at the paper but didn't pick it up. Her heart began a slow, heavy pounding against her ribs. "Mike, the IT department already concluded it was an external—" "Don't," Mike interrupted. The word was soft, but it cracked like a whip in the quiet room. "Don't insult my intelligence, Evelyn. I supervised the installation of this network architecture 10 years ago. An external breach leaves a forced entry signature. A manual deletion from an internal IP leaves a vacuum that requires executive admin clearance. He tapped the paper with a thick, calloused finger. Your clearance. The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn felt the air leaving her lungs. She looked up at him, searching for a way out, a lie that could hold the weight of the truth, but the disappointment in his pale blue eyes paralyzed her. He's playing you, Evelyn. Mike continued, the steady cadence of his voice relentless. Tyler didn't just make a mistake. He used you as a human shield, and you let him. You compromised your ethics, your career, and the safety of every single person working in this building for a man who wouldn't cross the street to pull you out of a fire. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. If I turn him in, the SEC will investigate my department. The promotion, the accounts, everything I've built. Everything you built. Mike let out a hollow, bitter laugh. Austin built the foundation. You just painted the walls, and now you're burning the house down. Hearing Austin's name spoken aloud felt like a physical blow. Evelyn flinched, stepping back until her spine hit the cold glass of the window. The SEC subpoena arrives on my desk tomorrow at noon, Mike said, buttoning his suit jacket. If you do not walk into legal by 9 a.m. and hand over the original access logs, I will hand over this diagnostic report. I am not letting you sink this firm to protect Tyler Black. He turned and walked toward the door. Mike, please, she called out, the facade of the untouchable senior VP completely shattering. You're the only friend I have left here. Mike paused in the doorway. He didn't look back. You made your choices, Evelyn, a long time ago. The door clicked shut. Evelyn was left entirely alone in the dim office, the piece of paper sitting on her desk like a death warrant. The city lights of Manhattan blurred outside the window as she realized the terrifying truth. There was no one left to manipulate, no one left to charm, and absolutely no one coming to save her. The digital clock on the dashboard of Evelyn's town car read 1:45 a.m. as she pulled up to Tyler's luxury high-rise in Chelsea. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflecting the harsh amber streetlights. She had used her spare key fob to bypass the concierge, slipping into the penthouse elevator like a thief in her own life. She didn't come to seek comfort. After Mike's ultimatum, she came for leverage. If she could find the burner device Tyler used to leak the Nexus documents, perhaps she could trace the recipient, pay them off, or somehow manipulate the digital trail before the 9 a.m. deadline. The apartment was dark and smelled faintly of expensive bourbon and stale cedar. From the master bedroom, the heavy rhythmic sound of Tyler's breathing confirmed he was deeply asleep. Evelyn moved like a ghost across the hardwood floor toward the kitchen island. There, resting next to a half-empty glass of whiskey, was his personal tablet. It was plugged into the wall, the screen dark, but the device unlocked a testament to the careless arrogance of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone. Her hands were trembling so violently she could barely swipe the screen. The harsh white glare of the display illuminated her ashen face in the pitch-black room. She opened his encrypted messaging app, bypassing the superficial chats, and searched for the keyword Nexus. A hidden folder materialized. The contact name was simply Vanguard, the holding company of Ashford Media's most aggressive competitor. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. She tapped the thread. The messages didn't start 3 days ago with the Nexus leak. They scrolled back continuously, a seemingly endless cascade of encrypted texts. Her finger hovered over the screen, and she dragged the timeline back to the very beginning. Exactly 24 months ago. The exact month Tyler had first approached her at the company retreat. Target acquired. The first message read, "She's ambitious, deeply insecure about her husband's shadow. I'm in." A wave of profound physical nausea hit Evelyn so intense she had to grip the edge of the marble countertop to keep from collapsing. She forced her eyes to keep reading each line, a surgical incision slicing through her pride. December 2024. Husband is a problem. Belle is sharp, keeps auditing her risk assessments. Need to create friction. I'll push her to demand more credit. June 2025. She filed for divorce. Belle walked away without a fight. The firewall is gone. I have full access to her network now. Yesterday, 11:30 p.m., she got the senior VP slot. Admin clearance secured. Sending the Nexus pre-merger projections now. Wire the remaining balance. The tablet slipped from Evelyn's numb fingers, clattering softly against the marble. There had never been a grand, sweeping romance. There was no shared ambition, no intoxicating chemistry, no victory. Tyler had never loved her. He had never even desired her. To him, she was merely a compromised password, a gullible inside man, a pathetic mark desperate enough for validation to hand over the keys to the kingdom. She looked toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. The urge to storm in, to scream, to shatter every piece of glass in the apartment clawed at her throat. But the humiliation was too absolute, too paralyzing for anger. Austin hadn't lost a competition. He had seen the trap, recognized the poison, and quietly stepped out of the blast radius, leaving her to detonate it herself. Evelyn backed away from the kitchen island, leaving the tablet glowing in the dark. She walked out of the apartment, the heavy door clicking shut, stepping into the cold, indifferent silence of the city as a woman who had finally realized she was entirely bankrupt. It took exactly 14 minutes to dismantle a decade of ruthless ambition. At 9 a.m., Evelyn had walked into the legal department, bypassed Mike Johnson entirely, and placed Tyler's unlocked tablet on the general counsel's desk. By 11 a.m., she was sitting in the executive boardroom. The panoramic view of Manhattan, once her daily conquest, now looked like a distant, unreachable shore. The CEO, a man who had toasted to her brilliance just 4 days ago, wouldn't meet her eyes. The HR director slid a manila folder across the polished oak table. The words indefinite administrative leave and pending federal investigation were printed in stark, unfeeling black ink. "We'll need your security badge, Evelyn," the HR director said, her voice stripped of all professional warmth, "and your company phone. Security will escort you to the freight elevator." Evelyn didn't argue. She unclipped the plastic badge from her lapel and placed it on the table. The soft clatter it made was the final punctuation mark on her career. As she was led down the sterile service corridors, bypassing the whispers of her former subordinates, she felt strangely weightless. The armor of her ego had been entirely, violently stripped away, leaving nothing but cold air against her skin. Instead of returning to the Chelsea penthouse, a monument to the lie Tyler had constructed, Evelyn drove her car north, merging onto the Henry Hudson Parkway. She drove for an hour, the rhythmic thumping of the tires over the asphalt, the only sound in the cabin, until she reached a quiet tree-lined street in Westchester. She pulled into the driveway of a 4-bedroom colonial. It was the house Austin had surrendered to her without a fight. She had kept the deed out of spite, a trophy of her victory, but she hadn't stepped foot inside since the day he packed his single duffel bag and left. The lock was stiff, protesting as she turned the key. When the heavy front door swung open, the smell of trapped stale air and dust hit her instantly. The house was empty. The movers had taken her furniture to the city months ago, leaving behind a cavernous shell. Evelyn walked slowly through the foyer, her footsteps echoing sharply against the bare hardwood floors. She walked into the kitchen. In the afternoon light, she could see the faint, faded rectangular patches on the painted walls where Austin's framed vintage maps used to hang. She traced her fingers over the cold granite of the kitchen island. This was where he used to sit at 2 a.m. drinking black coffee, silently rewriting her flawed PR strategies while she slept upstairs. This was where she had stood, sipping wine, convinced she was outgrowing him. She moved to the living room, stopping in the exact center of the empty space. The silence of the suburbs was different from the silence of her corner office. It wasn't the silence of power or anticipation. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a grave. Evelyn sank to her knees, the dust coating her expensive designer slacks. She looked around at the pristine, empty walls. She had wanted to be free. She had wanted to burn down the quiet, steady life the Austin had built for them so she could reign over the ashes. Sitting alone on the floor of the empty house, the cold creeping into her joints, Evelyn finally understood the absolute perfection of Austin's revenge. He hadn't destroyed her. He had simply stepped aside, allowing her to build her entire kingdom on a fault line, waiting for the day she would bury herself. The rain in lower Manhattan didn't look cinematic anymore. It was just cold gray and unrelenting. Evelyn sat in a cracked vinyl booth at a nondescript diner near Foley Square, the bitter taste of cheap burnt coffee coating her tongue. She had just spent 4 agonizing hours in a windowless deposition room, dismantling the last remnants of her career for the federal investigators. Across the chipped Formica table sat Greg, an old college roommate of Austin's who now worked as a compliance attorney in the district. Evelyn had ambushed him outside the courthouse, practically begging for 10 minutes of his time. Greg looked at her, his expression devoid of the hostility she expected. Instead, his eyes held a heavy, uncomfortable pity. For a woman who had spent the last 5 years demanding the envy of New York's elite, being looked at it with pity was a suffocating kind of torture. "You look tired, Evelyn," Greg said quietly, wrapping his hands around his ceramic mug. "Where is he, Greg?" she asked, her voice raspy, skipping the pleasantries. She didn't have the energy for armor anymore. "Just tell me where he went." Greg sighed, looking out the rain-streaked window at the gray city. "Why does it matter now the divorce is finalized? You got what you wanted." "Because I need to know," she pleaded, her fingers curling tightly around the edge of the table. She needed to know if he was drinking himself to sleep in a dark apartment. She needed to know if he was eagerly reading the financial blogs gloating over her public crucifixion. She needed to know that she still mattered to him, even if it was as a villain. "He's in Denver." Greg finally answered, his voice remarkably steady. "He moved out there a week after he signed the papers. Took a position as the lead systems architect for a green tech firm. He bought a house up near the foothills, a quiet place with a porch." Evelyn stared at him, the noise of the clattering diner fading into static. Denver. A quiet house. A porch. It sounded so agonizingly peaceful, a universe away from the chaotic wreckage of her life. "Did he—" Evelyn swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. "When the news broke about Ashford, about Tyler and the SEC, did he read it?" "I called him the day the subpoena hit the press," Greg said softly. "I asked him if he had seen the news about you." And Evelyn leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She braced herself for the anger, the bitter satisfaction, the vindication. "He said he hadn't seen it." Greg replied, his pale eyes meeting hers with brutal honesty. "I gave him the summary." He listened quietly. "When I was done, he said he was sorry to hear you were going through a difficult time, and then he asked me if my daughter had decided on a college yet." The air left Evelyn's lungs in a sudden, violent rush. "He didn't ask for details, Evie," Greg continued, his tone gentle but unyielding. "He didn't gloat. He didn't sound angry. He just moved on. None. He has a new life. A good one." Greg stood up, leaving a $10 bill on the table. He offered her one last, sympathetic nod before walking out into the rain. Evelyn remained frozen in the booth. She stared at the empty space across from her, the profound silence of Austin's indifference echoing in her mind. The opposite of love wasn't hate. It was apathy. She had destroyed her marriage, compromised her soul, and ruined her life, all under the arrogant assumption that she was the center of Austin's universe. But as she sat alone in the dim diner, entirely invisible to the man she had betrayed, the horrifying truth settled in her bones. Austin Bell had survived her easily. He had walked away from the fire she started, and he hadn't even looked back at the smoke. The wind coming off the Hudson River was biting, carrying the sharp chill of late autumn. Evelyn sat on a weathered wooden bench in Battery Park, her collar pulled up against the cold. The financial district loomed behind her, a fortress of glass and steel she was no longer permitted to enter. At exactly 4 p.m., Mike Johnson approached. He wore his usual gray overcoat, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. He didn't sit down. He stood a few feet away, maintaining a physical distance that felt like a quarantine line. Evelyn reached into her tote bag and pulled out a silver USB drive. The metal was cold against her numb fingers. "Everything is on here," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. The decrypted messaging logs from Tyler's tablet, the timeline of his communications with Vanguard. It proves he orchestrated the Nexus leak to sabotage the merger, and it proves he acted alone before I tried to cover the tracks. Mike looked at the small drive in her outstretched hand. He didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at Evelyn, really looked at her, seeing the hollowed-out cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, the complete collapse of the untouchable executive he once knew. Slowly, he took the drive, slipping it into his coat pocket. "This will clear the institutional charges against the firm. The board will be able to sever Vanguard's pipeline and hand Tyler over to the federal prosecutors." "And me?" Evelyn asked softly, though she already knew the answer. "Legal will use this to negotiate a plea for your tampering charge." Mike replied, his tone clinical, entirely devoid of the warmth they had shared for years. You won't face prison time, Evelyn, but you will never work in corporate communications again. You're radioactive. I know, she whispered. Mike gave a single curt nod. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness, nor was it a farewell. It was simply an acknowledgement of a transaction completed. He turned and walked back toward the towering skyline, leaving her alone on the bench as the sky bruised into a deep fading purple. Hours later, Evelyn sat on the floor of the Chelsea penthouse. The luxury apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene of her own making, littered with half-packed cardboard boxes. The legal retainers had already drained her savings, and the lease was being broken by the end of the week. The only light in the cavernous room came from the harsh white glow of her laptop screen. She opened her email client. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. In the recipient line, she typed Austin's old deactivated personal address. She stared at the blinking cursor in the body of the message. She thought about writing a novel, an explanation of her insecurities, her arrogance, the intoxicating, blinding rush of the affair. She thought about begging for his forgiveness, about telling him about the vintage watch, about the empty house in Westchester, about the paralyzing silence he had left behind. But she knew none of it mattered. Austin was in Denver. He had a porch. He had peace. He had survived her. In the end, she typed only 2 sentences. You were right about everything. I am so sorry. She stared at the words, the ultimate confession of a broken woman. She moved the cursor and clicked send. The progress bar flashed for a fraction of a second. Then a harsh, immediate chime echoed in the empty apartment. Mailer demon delivery status, notification. Failure, address not found. Evelyn slowly closed the laptop, plunging the room into absolute darkness. She pulled her knees to her chest and rested her forehead against them, listening to the muffled, distant sounds of the city below, a world spinning on perfectly, entirely indifferent to her absence. 14 months later, the wind coming off Lake Michigan carried a biting, relentless chill that Manhattan never had. Evelyn sat in the corner booth of a modest, independent coffee shop in downtown Chicago. There was no floor-to-ceiling glass, no panoramic view of a conquered city, only a condensation-fogged window looking out onto a gray, slush-covered street. She wore a plain wool coat and a muted turtleneck, her hair pulled back into a simple, unstyled knot. The designer labels and the tailored power suits had been sold off months ago to cover the last of her legal retainers. She took a sip of her drip coffee. It was lukewarm and bitter. On the scarred wooden table in front of her sat a mid-range laptop, its screen displaying a draft for a local dental clinic's social media campaign. It was a junior copywriter position at a boutique agency that barely paid enough to cover the rent of her one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. She had dropped the Brooks and was using her mother's maiden name to avoid the lingering toxic digital footprint of the Ashford scandal. A young waitress with tired eyes stopped by her table, wiping down the edge with a damp cloth. Need a refill, hon? No, thank you. Evelyn said, her voice quiet, lacking the sharp, demanding edge it once commanded in the corporate boardrooms of New York. The waitress nodded and moved on, entirely unaware that the woman sitting in the corner had once orchestrated multi-million-dollar narratives for global conglomerates. Here, Evelyn was just another face in the crowd, a ghost blending perfectly into the background noise of the city. She closed the laptop, the soft click of the plastic lid grounding her in the present. Sometimes, usually in the quiet hours of the early morning, the phantom limbs of her old life still ached. She would reach for a phone that no longer rang with urgent crises. She would expect to see the glittering skyline outside her window instead of a brick alleyway. She would brace herself for the intoxicating, dangerous rush of a secret message that never came. Tyler was currently serving a 3-year sentence in a minimum security federal facility in Pennsylvania. She hadn't visited. She hadn't even looked up the court transcripts. He was a closed chapter, a match that had burned her house down and turned to ash. But Austin? Austin was the silence that still echoed. She looked at her reflection in the fogged cafe window. The arrogant fire that used to define her features was gone, replaced by a weary, hollowed-out acceptance. She had spent years believing that Austin was the cage keeping her from flying. She had believed that by breaking his heart, she was setting herself free to conquer the world. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold silver casing of the vintage pocket watch. She carried it with her every day, not as a token of hope, but as a permanent compass of her own failure. Sitting in the dim light of the cafe, Evelyn finally understood the architecture of her ruin. Austin hadn't punished her. He hadn't fought back, hadn't sought public revenge, hadn't tried to destroy her reputation. He had simply given her exactly what she asked for, a life completely without him. She picked up her ceramic mug, holding it with both hands to absorb the fading warmth. Outside, the Chicago snow began to fall, burying the street in a quiet, indifferent white. Evelyn watched the snowflakes melt against the glass, embracing the profound, absolute stillness of the world she had built for herself.